It's pretty clear that we've been living in stressful times lately. A study from the National Institute of Mental Health found that 1 in 5 American children struggle with anxiety, while another study from the nonprofit Child Trends in 2018 found that just under half of children in the US have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, or a potentially traumatic experience or event that ranges from abuse and neglect to living with an adult with a mental illness, which can have lasting negative health impacts. Students today have also experienced a serious stressor, COVID-19. We have just lived through a pandemic that has surely brought a lot of anxiety as schools close down as lockdowns persist. To help its students cope with these unprecedented times, more and more schools have turned to mindfulness-based programs. There are many claimed benefits to mindfulness. Erica Sabinga, a professor of pediatrics at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, said, "Mindfulness, when delivered in a high-quality structured program, can be beneficial for youth." Sabinga has published several studies about the efficacy of mindfulness-based stress reduction programs and the benefits it provides to children and teenagers in terms of mental health, behavior, and conflict management. Other studies of mindfulness programs have found that they improved chronic pain, the body's immune system, and even have had similar effects to antidepressants for adults. But it's hard to define what high-quality structured program looks like. Furthermore, some researchers have contended that certain mindfulness-based programs in schools, such as Mind Up, are appropriating the tradition into the dominating Western modality of individualism and logical rationality. Specifically, that the focus on individual coping and the achievement of feeling better misses the whole point that mindfulness is a way of life and treats mindfulness as a cure to the symptoms rather than a tool to achieve liberation for all beings. On the other hand, some have argued that introducing mindfulness to, or even mandating mindfulness in US public schools leads to conflicts of conscience as religious elements are introduced to a strictly secular environment and as people of other religious backgrounds may fear that the Buddhist practice would conflict with their religious beliefs. In the course of this video, I'm going to explore how mindfulness-based programs have been designed and implemented in schools here in the US, and more specifically at Lafayette Elementary School here in Washington, D.C. I'll argue that mindfulness-based programs should be implemented in schools as they not only provide benefits to students in terms of stress reduction and emotional management, but they can also act as a potential gateway to introducing crucial values such as loving kindness and compassion and popularizing them to facilitate wellness for a greater amount of people overall. I like using this quote from Thầy Thich Nhat Hanh to explain mindfulness. Our true home is not in the past. Our true home is not in the future. Our true home is in the here and the now. Life is available only in the here and the now, and it is our true home. The idea of mindfulness comes from the word sati in Pali, or smriti in Sanskrit, or literally to remember. Essentially, by being aware of your senses, feelings, your thoughts, and your mind, you can remember to avoid unwholesome states and foster wholesome states as you head down the right path. John Kabat-Zinn, an American professor emeritus of medicine and Zen Buddhist student, described mindfulness as a moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. He pioneered the concept of the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. MBSR has influenced a lot of the mindfulness-based programs that go into not only schools, but hospitals and mainstream Western clinical practices as well. As while the program has its roots in Buddhism, the concept itself is presented as secular. In schools, mindfulness-based programs have taken many forms, from regular meditation sessions and classes teaching about basic values, to professional development for teachers, to even retreats led by Buddhists at Buddhist centers. For example, one school, Warner Arts Magnet Elementary School in Nashville, Tennessee, uses an expandable ball to demonstrate deep breathing and a liquid motion bubble timer filled with colorful oil to help students calm down. While a place I'm going to take a deep dive in is going to be Lafayette Elementary School. Linda Ryden, a peace teacher at the school, developed a mindfulness-based curriculum based on her experience teaching conflict resolution to Lafayette students and founded a nonprofit organization called Peace of Mind in 2018 to share her program with more schools.
I started about 20 years ago teaching a course in conflict resolution. And we had a lot of fights at our school back then, and it really seemed like the kids needed some skills in dealing with their conflicts. And so I did some research about sort of how to teach that. I had been a music teacher before. For a couple of years, my class really focused on conflict resolution and kindness and peace, and I didn't teach mindfulness. And I really found that even though the kids were learning quite a lot about how to work out conflicts, when it came to actually putting those skills into practice, like out on the playground,
Mhm.
They were still getting into fights all the time. And so I really couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. And I remember one day some kids came in and they got in trouble at recess and they were, all mad. And I was like, guys, why didn't you use the conflict resolution skills we've been learning? And they were like, oh, I was just so mad. I couldn't think, I couldn't remember what you said. So I really started thinking about that. And I was like, what's going wrong? Why can't they remember what we're learning? So I started doing some research and really started to think that what they needed was help in calming down because they knew what to
Mhm.
do when they were calm.
I then asked Miss Ryden what inspired her peace of mind curriculum, and here's her response.
Sharon Salzberg, who's, kind of the preeminent expert on compassion practices and stuff. I've learned a lot from her. I learned a lot. My sort of primary meditation teacher is a teacher named Jeff Warren in Toronto. There really weren't very many programs for kids when I was starting. And so there wasn't a lot to copy. Daniel Siegel and Rick Hansen, who both wrote a lot about the brain, and that was really helpful to me. And really, the information about the brain was really helpful to my students.
The Peace of Mind program is a multi-year program from early childhood all the way up to middle school. Students do everything from breathing exercises to learning about the anatomy of the brain, exploring how feelings develop, and even lead class in school-wide exercises.
Yeah, all the classes really start out the same way. We start out with a mindful moment. And so I always choose a student to sit with me. I have like this little couch up at the front of my classroom. And so a student will be the mindfulness helper and they'll sit with me and they'll help me lead the mindfulness practice that we're going to do. So like when I'm working with the younger kids, we're usually doing a breathing practice, and I'm often asking them to sort of create their own ways of doing mindful breathing, based on animals or activities that they like. If they're baseball breathing, they breathe in and breathe out, like with the little kids, they really love that. But I feel like it's really important that my goal is that mindfulness become part of their life and sort of who they are. So I don't want them to have to like memorize practices that I'm teaching them, but to incorporate them into their own lives.
Mhm.
And with the older kids, we'll do, maybe like a metacognition practice, or focusing practice, focusing on your breath and counting your breaths and trying to notice when your mind has wandered. And then after that, we do like a partner practice. We call it kindness pals. And so I give them a random partner. And this year, I've been teaching the kids some sign language, and it's kind of like the way I started with mindfulness. Like I don't really know much sign language, but I decided I wanted to learn, and so I decided to use sign language as a way for kids to talk about their feelings. So we learned all the signs for different feelings and emotions, and then we learned how to ask each other, "How are you feeling today?" and telling people, "I feel happy today." And so they spend some time with their kindness pal at the beginning of class, practicing the sign language and asking each other how they feel. And they kind of walk around the room and ask different partners how they feel. And then we'll do whatever the sort of lesson of the class is. So if we're in most of my classes, we've been focusing on conflict resolution and over the last few weeks. So I'm teaching a concept called the conflict escalator, where you think about how a conflict kind of starts as a small problem, but because of the things that people say or do, that it sort of goes up the steps of the escalator, and at the top of the escalator is always trouble. So we try to figure out like what caused the conflict to escalate, and then we talk about what happens in your brain if you're going up the conflict escalator. That usually means that your amygdala has sort of hijacked your brain. And so, how can you use some deep breaths to signal to your amygdala that you're not in danger anymore? And once you have done that, then your prefrontal cortex can sort of help you to apologize and work out the conflict. And it's a special at my school, so so it's the same as like art or gym or music. They just have it every week.
The benefits of implementing mindfulness in schools seem pretty obvious. More and more research have been showing promising evidence of the benefits of teaching mindfulness, including research I mentioned before from Dr. Sabenga. In England, a study published in the British Journal of Psychiatry found children who participated in the intervention reported fewer depressive symptoms post-treatment and at follow-up, and lower stress and greater well-being at follow-up. The Mindfulness in Schools program, the program behind the .B mindfulness curriculum, have also reported overwhelmingly positive statistics in their surveys. They claim that 98% of teachers said the majority of their class found .B extremely, very, or fairly useful, and that 100% of teachers said .B supported their pupils in coping with difficulty. One teacher said, "It has already had an impact on the students, and this can be seen by calmer, more focused students. Students have said that the learnings from this course have also stopped some of them from losing their temper or walking out of exams." Ms. Ryden claims that while it is hard to quantitatively evaluate the benefits of implementing peace of mind, there are plenty of anecdotal examples of how the environment in the school has benefited.
Anecdotally, like we can say that when teachers and kids and families come from other schools, they're always pretty surprised at the behavior here, that it's really different. And when our kids here go on to middle school, they're just like, oh my God, you can't believe what's happening at the middle school, and it's not like we don't have problems. I mean, there's definitely kids who get into fights and stuff. It's a little bit more of an aberration, like if kids are fighting, then it's like, oh my God, did you see they were fighting, or if people are being mean. Sometimes I'll do lessons about bullying or something, and I'll be describing a scenario and the kids are like, that would never happen here, and so I think there's just like this expectation of how, at least how they think that they should treat each other. And I think that for the most part, given how big our school is, it's like 900 kids, like they do really well. Like they try really hard to be respectful and kind.
Implementing high-quality mindfulness programs as a core part of a school's curriculum can really do more than benefit individual students. It can transform the atmosphere of a school, depending on the comprehensiveness of what is being taught, maybe through not only personal exercises, but also the understanding behind how emotions arise and the cultivation of certain values like empathy and compassion. Students really do take the teachings and practice to heart, which can uplift the whole collective. I want to be a bit careful though when I'm talking about the benefits of mindfulness-based programs, because focusing on how mindfulness relieves stress for students or helps them from getting into fights with other students or walking out of exams may be a good pitch to school administrators and to parents. They reflect a somewhat deeper idea of taking an item from a different culture and morphing it into another context without really acknowledging the original purpose and context mindfulness is based in. Particularly, Maria Ishikawa claims that Zen mindfulness-based programs that focuses on student benefits can be an example of highlighting individualism and using mindfulness as a tool in order to fit back into the dominant individualistic system rather than using it in its intended way, or as she puts it, to better serve others and for the betterment of civilization. Ishikawa makes the argument that as there is a clear power imbalance between the dominant Western influence group and minority groups, the co-opting of cultural elements from minority groups such as mindfulness without acknowledging the full cultural context and specific purposes of the practice is inherently harmful. As an example of Western colonizers justifying overtaking Native American land and imposing their own knowledge structures by dismissing the value of the relationship between indigenous people and their land, she argues that dominant cultures establishing mindfulness-based practices justified by Western traditions of science means that mindfulness in its original cultural context and purpose is presented as not having value. In other words, by using neuroscience and individual benefits to back up mindfulness-based programs, mindfulness's validity is reduced to being dependent on a dominant Western modalities to be acceptable rather than being acknowledged in its own paradigm. It's no longer a way of life or a means to shape society, but rather just one of many different tools to reinforce society and its power structures. An example she uses is Mind Up, a mindfulness-based program created by American actress Goldie Hawn. Hawn claims that she created the program to, quote, help improve student focus, engagement in learning academics, and give them the tools and strategies that would bring joy into the classroom. Benefits for implementing its programs that highlight underlying individualistic motives, such as responding more thoughtfully and mindfully rather than be reactive, and teachers will be happier, more joyful, and experience greater job satisfaction. Ishikawa states that this program is an example of a program that neglects the specific cultural context and purpose of mindfulness. She goes on to say, quote, Hyland describes mindfulness as having no connections with the broad transformation of perspectives, which allows for the fostering of wholesome thoughts and feelings and the reduction of harmful rumination and avoidance. The absence of accepting suffering without accepting the existence of suffering, a founding principle of mindfulness. The inherent humanness of mindfulness and Zen practices that non-judgmentally accepts all emotions is removed. End quote. The conversation I had with Ms. Wright helped me a lot in understanding how carefully planned mindfulness programs can really benefit a school environment more than just treating mindfulness as a tool in and of itself to help students. I was especially pleasantly surprised with the program's incorporation of elements of social justice and equity, using the recognition of inner biases cultivated from mindfulness as a sort of momentum to start tackling the bigger questions of the underlying causes behind their unease, such as structural racism or gender inequality.
Sometimes I think people try to, they think they should bring in a mindfulness program to a school to calm the kids down, and I'm like, that's not what it's for. Like, it's the mindfulness skills are for their own benefit, their own use, and
Right.
they should be deciding like what they want to do with it. Like when I'm looking for funders, for example, like they often want to say like, well, you need to be working in schools in poor neighborhoods and schools with more, Black and brown children and stuff like, and they're like, those kids really need it. And I'm like, those kids, like, what do you like? That's, first of all, like, I don't like that language is offensive. And secondly, that I think that it doesn't respect the fact that kids who are like living in poverty or who are living in any kind of violent situation, like, have every right to be behaving the way they are. If, like, we're asking so much of these children. And I don't think it's right to bring in a program and sort of say like, we're going to calm you down. Like, we're not going to try to fix the world you're living in. We're just going to try to make it easier for you to behave in it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I don't want to be part of that. Like, I think that, so that's why I have a social justice aspect to my curriculum. And like, really, I want kids to understand the world that they live in. And like, if they're, if you live in a situation where maybe your neighborhood isn't very safe, or you don't always have the food you need to eat, like, you're going to be more easily triggered, and because you are kind of have to be more hyper vigilant. And so to say to those kids like, you just need to calm down, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, it's that's not really in their best interest. So I want kids to understand like there are reasons for their force, like the patriarchy, white supremacy, like there are forces that are causing the situation that they're living in that are wrong, and that we need to try to dismantle those forces. And one of the ways we can do that is through mindfulness practices, where we can express our anger in a way where we're not out of control, but we can be calmly angry and really make change in the world.
Ishikawa suggests that mindfulness-based programs must be properly contextually situated and not misappropriated for individualistic purposes, or they must be defined as what they actually mean, whether that's individualized stress reduction or otherwise. And while mindfulness programs do still have some elements of that individual-centered focus, some of these programs, like Peace of Mind, actually do acknowledge the idea that mindfulness should not be removed from the society around it and should be used in the pursuit of social justice. And while I do somewhat agree with the point that using neuroscience rather than Buddhism to justify the benefits of mindfulness reinforces the value of the dominant Western lens of knowledge and neglects the value of other minority lens, which can lead to material harms as these seemingly inferior cultures and identities are erased, there are another set of concerns to address as well. The very first part of the Constitution's First Amendment enshrined the idea of separation of church and state, an idea that has evolved to mean that in state-managed areas, such as public schools, religion is a strict no-go. And in my email correspondence with Ms. Ryden, she did state that because she's a public school teacher, she is not allowed to base any part of her curriculum on Buddhism. Candy Gunther Brown, a professor of religious studies at Indiana University, devotes an entire chapter to secularity and mindfulness-based practices in her book Debating Yoga and Mindfulness in Public Schools. She claims that while programs such as Mind Up and Calmer Choice strictly try to be secular in order to not bring up any controversy, their efforts to maintain secularity actually paradoxically enhances the potency of instilling values and beliefs that are associated with religions, in this case, Buddhism. This potency has led led to controversy. For example, one program nearly faced a lawsuit from concerned parents. Calmer Choice, a program created in 2010 by occupational therapist, parent, and mindfulness practitioner Fiona Jensen in response to a drug-related murder and multiple suicides of local high school students, was designed as a universal prevention program that was taught to all students as part of the formal school day to reduce risks of violence, suicide, and self-destructive behaviors by instilling kindness and compassion. In Cape Cod, Massachusetts, a Christian parent on the school board challenged the program on 2 grounds: risks of adverse effects and Buddhist underpinnings. The parent, Michelle Conover, sought an attorney, the same attorney who was also involved in a case where he unsuccessfully challenged the constitutionality of implementing yoga in schools, who agreed to help pro bono. In February 2016, Conover's attorney issued a legal memorandum asking the Dennis-Yarmouth Regional School District to stop teaching Calmer Choice. The district ignored the memo, and Conover's attorney just did not have enough resources to take this matter to court. Who knows whether their challenge might have succeeded. But what's important is not the outcome of what would have been a lawsuit, but the idea behind it. Non-Buddhist parents are worried about the potential sense of a conflict of conscience if their non-Buddhist children are mandated to practice a tradition that is not associated with their worldview. And while certain authorities, such as the Second Vatican Council of Catholic Christians, ratify that mindfulness has nothing in conflict with Christianity and should even be held in a high regard by Christians, it does seem at face value that if you're a parent, you would reasonably be worried that you're abandoning your faith. And the claims about mindfulness programs having Buddhist underpinnings are not invalid. Brown claims that the usage of the word mindfulness in programs is a signpost leading to deeper exploration of resources that are tied to Buddhism. If you do a Google search of mindfulness, you're eventually going to end up with resources that talk about mindfulness's origins in Buddhism and its Buddhist context online. You don't need schools to invoke Buddhism in a mindfulness class to have students understand that the two are connected. The prevalence of the internet today means that most students will eventually deduce it on their own. So students will learn about the original context and purpose behind mindfulness, they will learn about its Buddhist roots, and they will associate mindfulness and maybe even their programs in schools with Buddhism. It's reasonable to conclude that a well-designed mindfulness program, therefore, should balance introducing the contextual values and underlying beliefs behind mindfulness to provide the entire and accurate picture of what the practice should look like, while avoiding the invocation of specific references to Buddhism or religion. But I do want to note how the separation of church and state isn't as simple as no God or deity in government, because there is mention of God. In our government-printed banknotes and in the oaths our public servants, our presidents, our congresspeople, our senators take when they enter government. So in a sense, the usage of the Establishment Clause leave out the Buddhist roots of mindfulness and instead connect mindfulness practices to neuroscience and Western objective forms of knowledge is just an instance of a dominant group taking away the validity and the value of minority worldviews while co-opting minority cultures in conformity with dominant structures. That's a strong message. It's like saying, we'll take what we think is valuable, but we won't acknowledge you because you're not a part of us. Rather than tearing barriers down, this co-option reinforces a power imbalance in society and prevents minority groups from owning their own narratives. In a world of things like police brutality against African Americans and hate crimes against minorities like Asian Americans, that's dangerous. And so, while there is a practical concern to maintain secularity, lest risk having the opportunity of practicing mindfulness be shut out altogether, mindfulness programs should not shy away from being as complete as possible in introducing values of interconnectedness, non-judgmentalism, and even introducing a bit about the nature of suffering and the role mindfulness plays in resolving it. In response to John Kabat-Zinn's book, Full Catastrophe Living, which describes mindfulness-based stress reduction programs and seeks to introduce the underlying dharma of the program while omitting Buddhism or references to Buddhist concepts explicitly, Taittiriya himself had this to say, and I quote, "This very readable and practical book will be helpful in many ways. I believe many people will profit from it. Reading it, you will see that meditation is something that deals with our daily life. The book can be described as a door opening both on the Dharma from the side of the world and on the world from the side of the Dharma. When the Dharma is really taking care of the problems of life, it is true Dharma. And this is what I appreciate most about the book. I thank the author for having written it." The point is that ideas and concepts taught by the mindfulness-based programs, whether explicitly Buddhist or not, create some sort of entrance. And while yes, they may not be talking about sati or the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path, they're facilitating those ideas so that they can be discovered, explored, and disseminated into more and more and more spaces, eventually reaching a point where it becomes mainstream. A dharma that helps people, that improves their lives, is good dharma. And when the good dharma becomes mainstream, all with the ideas of being alert to your state and using that alertness to cultivate wholesome deeds and to not cultivate unwholesome deeds, you'll get roughly the same effect as what Ms. Ryden described at Lafayette. A better environment for more people. Heck, I dare say even a better society can be created, as long as programs are carefully designed and are comprehensive, and as long as they focus not only on individualistic benefits but also expand to include society as a whole. I think that there is a massive incentive for schools to adopt these mindfulness-based programs.